The short life of Aerea Targaryen is one of the strangest, saddest, and most mysterious branches of House Targaryen's family tree. Her death, arguably the most brutal and bizarre in the history of Westeros, is what she is remembered for most, but many questions about her fate remain, and one of the most fascinating unsolved puzzles in Aerea's experience is one that is hardly ever discussed when this fiery Targaryen becomes the topic of conversation. When it comes to Aerea Targaryen's tale, it's important to note that she likely wasn't Aerea Targaryen at all. Aerea and Rhaella Targaryen were identical twins born to Prince Aegon and Princess Rhaena in 42 AC. Young Aerea was terrified of almost everything, while young Rhaella was a terror who was sent to Old Town to become a Septa. However, when Jaehaerys was crowned king in Old Town and both girls were together, these identical twins traded personalities. Or as anyone can likely surmise, they traded names and places with each other. With this swap, Rhaella became the heir to the throne, left the life of a Septa behind, and returned to King's Landing. By all accounts, she was thrilled with the excitement of life in the Red Keep, even if those around her weren't thrilled by her presence. But all good things come to an end, and like many Targaryens who were close to inheriting the throne, Aerea's life was sidelined by a succession crisis. Aerea and Rhaella were the daughters of Prince Aegon Targaryen and Princess Rhaena Targaryen, granddaughters of Aenys Targaryen, and grandnieces of Maegor the Cruel. Prince Aegon went to battle against Maegor the Cruel to claim the Iron Throne, but he lost and was killed. Princess Rhaena was then married to Maegor the Cruel, and Maegor named Aerea as his heir until he had a son, which obviously he never ended up having. Maegor disinherited Jaehaerys, his nephew, Aenys' son, and Aerea's father's older brother. So, although Jaehaerys claimed the Iron Throne after Maegor, there was a contingent who argued that Aerea was the more valid claimant. However, Aerea was still the shy, frightened twin, so most agreed that she wasn't fit to rule. It was during King Jaehaerys' coronation in Old Town that Aerea and Rhaella pulled off the Parent Trap switch. So the newfound Aerea escaped the Septas and also became Jaehaerys' heir until he had children. As Targaryens are wont to do, Jaehaerys took the throne and almost immediately muffed things up by marrying his sister Alysanne, even though his council and predecessors had determined that marrying siblings to each other was a bridge too far for the people of Westeros, and the dynasty might not survive yet another incestual king and queen. It was Jaehaerys' own hand of the king and stepfather, Rhaegar Baratheon, who considered casting Jaehaerys aside and replacing him with Aerea. But by the time the Baratheons took action, Aerea had been disguised as a common girl working in the stables near the King's Gate. In the following year, Jaehaerys and Alysanne took things public and official, so Aerea and her mother, the former Queen Rhaena, were reunited and sent to Dragonstone. Aerea reportedly loathed almost everything about Dragonstone, except for the friendship she cultivated with Elisa Farman. Aerea was eventually replaced as Jaehaerys' heir in 53 AC, when he and Alysanne had children of their own. And when Elisa Farman later left Dragonstone to sail into the Sunset Sea, Aerea became even more rebellious and angry. In late 54 AC, Aerea finally claimed her own dragon, none other than Balerion the Black Dread, and vanished for over a year. She reappeared in 56 AC, and although her life had been a pretty exciting one, it was her looming death that would cement her into the history books of Planetos' hidden horrors. When Aerea landed in King's Landing, she was starving, filthy, and suffering from some kind of disease or parasitic infection that almost defies description. Septon Barth had apparently never seen anything like it before. Aerea was incredibly gaunt, but there were some kind of creatures writhing beneath her skin. She seemed to be cooking from the inside out, smoke emerging from every orifice, and she got so hot that her eyes burst. Then, when Aerea was put into an ice bath, bizarre scorching organisms emerged from her skin, only to die in the icy water. Aerea's corpse was cremated, and her mother, Queen Rhaena, spread her ashes in the sky from Dreamfire's back. And although Aerea apparently never explained what actually happened to her, Septon Barth surmised that Balerion must have taken her back to Valyria, and whatever creatures had destroyed her from the inside out originated in Valyria. Given how nightmarish and shocking this entire event was, Septon Barth's description of it is surprisingly brief, although we may have King Jaehaerys to thank for that. Sir Lucamore Strong, one of Jaehaerys' Kingsguard, carried Aerea to Grand Maester Bennifer and Septon Barth for treatment, and he claimed that he could feel the heat coming off of her through his armor. But Jaehaerys commanded him to not speak of Aerea anymore after this. The king also seemingly thought that Septon Barth's explanation of the tragedy had some validity to it, as Jaehaerys prohibited any ship that was suspected of visiting Valyria from landing in Westeros, and proclaimed that any Westerosi who went to Valyria would be executed upon their return. Aerea's brutal and strange end also seemed to inspire Septon Barth to begin his investigation into the nature of dragons, magic, and sorcery. So it would appear that he didn't commit a lot of what he actually saw or experienced with her to the annals of history. It was quite literally an unspeakable horror, and is likely the most gruesome death in the recorded history of Westeros, even if we don't know the half of it. So suffice it to say, Aerea Targaryen lived quite a life for a girl who didn't even make it to her mid-teen years. And while whatever killed her was the most unforgettable aspect of her story, she really was extraordinary from beginning to end. Septon Barth's speculations about how Aerea may have died certainly have some legs to stand on, but one question that readers rarely seem to ask is, what actually happened during the period of Aerea's unrecorded history? The notion that Balerion may have returned to Valyria because that was his home makes some sense, but whatever killed Aerea killed her extremely quickly. She was dead within a day of returning to Westeros, but she was actually gone for over a year. Whatever remains after the doom of Valyria is a bit of a mystery, because it's one of those places that people simply go to and never come back from. As far as we know, Euron Greyjoy is the only person who maybe made it to Valyria and back unscathed, but his claims are dubious, and that would still leave him as a stark exception to the many who have gone there and vanished. Aerea returns to Westeros with a fatal infection, but even Balerion comes back with injuries, a wound 9 feet long and dripping with blood. So if we are to assume that they did encounter these dangers in Valyria, that a dragon as big as Balerion was even in danger there, it comes as no surprise that it's the Peninsula of No Return. However, the timeline here is a bit suspicious. If Valyria is basically a black hole of death, if it's home to creatures that could burn Aerea alive from the inside within hours, or could do serious damage to an animal as big and ferocious as Balerion, then it's also hard to believe that a 14-year-old girl could survive there for more than a year prior to her deadly return to Westeros. Ergo, while they may have been in Valyria when Balerion was wounded and Aerea was infected, it seems very implausible that they were in Valyria the entire time they were gone. This obviously veers into highly speculative territory, but it's an interesting consideration, especially since every era of Aerea's life is extremely documented, aside from the year that she completely vanished without a trace. Considering how conspicuous Balerion is, much of the known world is automatically eliminated as a possibility. Obviously, Aerea being lost in Westeros is out, and the vast majority of Essos is out as well. Even if she and Balerion made it to Yi Ti, rumors that they'd been spotted somewhere at some point would eventually make it to Westeros. And given that Aerea arrived in King's Landing nearly starved, it seems safe to assume that she spent a long time in a region that was uninhabited and didn't have an easily accessible food source. Someplace like Ib would be a fun possibility, as it is difficult to survive in alone, and rumor has it that dragon bones have even been found there. Or an even further desolate land like the Grey Waste would at least explain why Aerea had become so emaciated. However, these seem unlikely, both because the cold northern regions haven't historically been super appealing to dragons, and because Balerion undoubtedly would have been spotted flying in the general area of the Free Cities. So, given that Aerea and Balerion vanished without a trace, and given that Balerion probably would have chosen the warm wilderness over the frosty forests, it seems like they must have gone somewhere south rather than north. The Summer Isles is the closest option, but there are some connections from these islands to Westeros, so if Aerea and Balerion had landed there, word would have gotten back to the kingdoms at some point. Many of the other lands in the Summer Sea and the Jade Sea are partially inhabited and a part of trade routes that eventually connect to Westeros. So Aerea and Balerion would have theoretically encountered someone somewhere who would tell the tale of an enormous dragon flying overhead, and Aerea would have hopefully been able to find enough sustenance in order to survive. Sothorios is obviously a fun option, and would certainly explain why Aerea returned to Westeros in such rough shape. But it also feels unlikely for the same reason that a year-long vacation in Valyria seems unlikely. Sothorios is pretty notoriously dangerous. It's not quite on the level of the Doom, but someone from Westeros spending an extended period of time here without dying is borderline impossible. But interestingly, there are a few hints that a sojourn in Sothorios isn't off the table for Aerea and Balerion. In Fire and Blood, Eustace Hightower does become stranded on Sothorios for a full year before eventually returning to Westeros. And he literally describes worms, almost too small to see, in the fresh water that lay their eggs inside of people if they drink them, as well as mentioning unbearable deadly fevers. Asshai is another interesting possibility, and there are a few hints that this isn't as improbable as it might first seem. Asshai records of history are hard to find and sometimes harder to believe, but there are theories that dragon taming didn't originate in Valyria, but in the Shadow itself. And those original dragon masters actually brought their knowledge to the Valyrians. Septon Barth speculates that this is more rumor than fact, because if the mages of Asshai managed to control dragons, then why didn't they conquer the world as the Valyrians did? I think that there's more to be uncovered in the history of Asshai, though, because it's very interesting that both Asshai and Valyria seem to be cursed lands. Asshai's history is lost to time, but it's a massive city that is now almost empty. The food and water that is consumed by those who remain has to be imported, because nothing really survives there, and only those with some extraordinary mystical abilities seem to last very long. Of course, these beliefs about Asshai aren't necessarily fact, but it does seem meaningful that there are rumors that Asshai first tamed dragons, and now it's essentially magically radioactive. And we know for a fact that Valyria tamed dragons, and it has become Planetos' newest Chernobyl. There are also plenty of magic users in the city who would probably like to have access to a dragon if possible. And there is another interesting hint that this isn't as improbable as it might seem. In A Game of Thrones, Bran 3, Bran sees a series of visions that seem to become real, and he thinks, "He lifted his eyes and saw clear across the narrow sea, to the free cities in the green Dothraki sea and beyond, to Vaes Dothrak under its mountain, to the fabled lands of the Jade Sea, to Asshai by the Shadow, where dragons stirred beneath the sunrise." But, while there is a clear connection between Asshai and dragons, it still seems unlikely that a dragon like Balerion could make an appearance there without the word spreading. It may be a city dark and full of terrors, but it's not a black hole of information from which nothing escapes. And that's why I think that Aerea and Balerion spent a significant chunk of their time away from Westeros in Ulthos. Obviously, this is a bit of a left-field conspiracy theory, so let's go back to the basics to explain why I actually think this. Aerea Targaryen's story is largely based around the suppositions of Septon Barth. His speculation that something from Valyria killed her and injured Balerion is an understandable one, but his fundamental conjecture as to why all of this happened seems a little suspect. He assumes that Aerea didn't have control over Balerion, so the dragon returned to its former home of Valyria, and the two of them encountered something dangerous to dragons and deadly to humans. But this actually seems like a really odd conclusion to come to, considering the timeline of everything else. Yes, we know it's possible for riders to have trouble controlling dragons. The most obvious instance is Dany's difficulty controlling Drogon when she first flies. But context clues don't really dovetail with that theory when it comes to Aerea. Unclaimed dragons do have a history of flying wild and being spotted in different places. But before Aerea claimed Balerion, he had been an unclaimed dragon for years. And as far as we know, he spent most of, if not all of that time, on Dragonstone. And if he had wanted to return to Valyria, he had more than half a decade of freedom where he could have done that. But on the contrary, he disappears as soon as Aerea claimed him, which to me seems to pretty conclusively indicate that Aerea is the inciting factor here. By virtue of the fact that Balerion leaves the moment that Aerea becomes his new rider, not the moment before or the moment after, it seems to show that Aerea must have been the decision-maker. So then the obvious question is, if Aerea was the one who decided where she and Balerion were going, why would she decide to go to Ulthos of all places? And I think that she didn't. I think that she decided to go in the same direction as Alyssa Farman. If we're being generous, Aerea had contentious relationships with nearly everyone in her life, and Alyssa Farman seemed to be a very notable exception. Alyssa often talked about leaving Westeros and returning to the wide western seas, and Aerea was desperate to come with her. As we all know, Alyssa Farman did leave Westeros on the Sunchaser, sailing into the Sunset Sea, never to return. And Aerea was reportedly devastated to be left behind. While attempting to cross the Sunset Sea is a notoriously deadly endeavor, years after this whole saga, Corlys Velaryon believes that he sees the Sunchaser in Asshai, clearly hinting at the possibility or probability that Alyssa Farman survived and made it to land after sailing the Sunset Sea. And it's not actually that hard to imagine that an angry, friendless teenager claimed the biggest dragon in the world, realized she could go anywhere, and decided to take off in the direction of the only person she had shown much interest in before. Aerea and Balerion heading west rather than east would fill in a lot of the obvious gaps in their whole timeline. It'd at the very least explain how the biggest dragon in existence cannot be spotted by anyone anywhere for a year. And it could possibly explain how Alyssa Farman could survive the Sunset Sea crossing, but basically never be heard from again. Clearly, we don't even know how big this world really is. But we do know that the Sunset Sea is seen as a bit of a point of no return for the sailors who dare to cross it. And we know that there's a gap between where the western and eastern edges of the maps end that is home to something. And given that Ulthos is just a stone's throw away from Essos, and Asshai in particular, it's also very plausible that anyone who actually made it across the ocean by air or by sea would run into Ulthos before they hit Essos. As far as we know, Ulthos doesn't seem to be inhabited by humans, and it's supposedly covered in a dense jungle. So Aerea having difficulty surviving or finding food there would also make sense. And, whether or not she actually found Alyssa or the Sunchaser, it is believable that she would have landed on Ulthos when she went westward in search of her friend. Interestingly, this wouldn't necessarily exclude the possibility of Balerion and Aerea landing in Valyria and getting injured there either. If she tried and failed to find Alyssa, or did actually find her but for some reason decided to leave, taking the known route from the far east home to Westeros would be a logical choice, given how risky the Sunset Sea notoriously is. And possibly more importantly, Aerea's idea of home and Balerion's idea of home could be very different. So if she was unclear in her desires or directions, deciding to go to her home of Westeros but landing in Balerion's home of Valyria and encountering some incredible danger is believable. Of course, it's entirely possible that Aerea and Balerion spent a lot of, or even all of their missing time in Valyria. Undeniably, a bunch of parasitic, fiery worm monsters that cook you from the inside out have distinctly Valyrian vibes to them. But either way, Aerea Targaryen almost certainly had a nightmare vacation in one of the places that people go and never return from. However, I think vanishing into the west after Elisa Farman is actually even more believable an explanation as the theory of Balerion returning to his homeland is. Ultimately, Aerea Targaryen has one of the most interesting and most tragic life stories of any Targaryen, and that's really saying something. In barely 14 years, she saw and did things that most people never would, and maybe never should. And the most interesting part of her story is a tale that we'll never even know. But what do you think? Is the historical retelling of and speculation about Aerea Targaryen's life accurate? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.